What's up, TUMNAD Lectures? In this video, we are going to be looking at the anatomy of the stomach. If it is your very first time to watch me, please make sure you subscribe. You turn on the notification bell such that whenever I load the video, you become the very first one to watch. So let's go ahead and get started and look at the anatomy of the stomach. You know, the stomach is going to be that muscular organ that is going to be residing within what we call the epigastric region, okay? And you also have some part that extends what we call the left hypochondriac region. This kind of the stomach is going to be also located between what we call the esophagus, that is on the superior aspect, and then also what we call the first segment of the small intestine, which we call the duodenum. Okay, so now we are going to be seeing this model, and of course this is going to be the anatomical position of the stomach. So now how it is supposed to be looking in what we call the human body. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at the different parts that make up what we call the stomach. Okay. Now, the whole of this structure here, okay, the whole of this structure here, the whole of this one here is what we call the cardia. Okay, so what we call the cardia, and it's going to be having what we call the cardiac sphincter that allows the bolus to move down to what we call the stomach. Okay, so now this one here is going to be what we call the cardia, having what we call the cardiac sphincter, or which people some call the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay. Then when we come up here, this kind of the dome shape, okay, the kind of the dome shape just on the superior aspect. You know how this dome shaped structure is called? This part of the stomach is what we call the fundus, okay? It's what we call the fundus, going to be housing what we call storage of what we call indigested food, and even also what we call the gases, okay? Now, as you move down the whole of this structure from here, moving down the whole of this structure here. This one, the largest part of the stomach, you know what is called? The whole of this structure here is what we call the body of the stomach. Okay, is what we call the body of the stomach, or which some people call the corpus. Okay, it is the largest part of what we call the stomach. Okay. Then as we move off the body, we have this other part of the stomach, which we call the pyloric antrum. Okay, hold this structure here we call the pyloric antrum. Super very important, having different kind of the cells, like what we call the G cells, what we call the D cells, that regulate, that stimulate the different cells to release different substances in what we call the stomach to aid in different physiological processes. Okay. Then after what we call the pyloric antrum, we have what we call the pyloric canal. Okay, the pyloric canal is going to be the last part of the stomach as you move to what we call the duodenum. So the whole of this part here is going to be what we call the pyloric canal. Okay, and then of course the pyloric canal is going to be terminating here where we have another kind of the sphincter that regulates how much of the chyme leaves the stomach. You know how this kind of this sphincter is called here, that regulates how much of the chyme go to the duodenum? We have what we call the pyloric sphincter. Okay, what we call the pyloric sphincter that regulates how much of the chyme should leave what we call the stomach. Okay. And then within this kind of the stomach, the part of the stomach where we're going to be having the strongest peristaltic movement is going to be this kind of this area, okay? What we call the pyloric antrum, okay? We're going to be having extensive, strongest peristaltic movement to propel food to bypass what we call the pyloric sphincter. But of course, if food is not yet chunked very well to make what we call the chyme, it is now propelled back to what we call the body of the stomach, and that's what we call retropulsion. The pushing back that kind of the chyme which is not yet ready to bypass what we call the pyloric sphincter. Super very important. Okay. And then you're going to be having what we call this kind of the curvature, which we call the lesser curvature. Okay, what we call the lesser curvature. And then we have also what we call the greater curvature. Okay, the whole of this kind of this curve here, which we call the greater curvature. Okay. When we go inside, we have this kind of the folds inside the stomach. You know how these folds are called? These are going to be what we call the rug. Okay, they are what we call the rug of the stomach. Super very important, increasing the surface area for chemical and then mechanical digestion. Okay, these are what we call the rug of the stomach. These folds. Okay. And then, of course, when you look at the stomach, we're going to be having on its wall, you're going to be having a lot of layers. You have around 4 layers of the stomach, and generally the entire GIT. Okay. So now we are going to be having the inner layer, which is going to be what we call the mucosa. Okay, the mucosa, which is going to be also having some other 3 layers, like what we call the epithelium, which is the innermost, which is going to be in contact with what we call the food and even water. And then next to it, which you have what we call the lamina propria, and then finally what we call the muscularis mucosae. That also, all those one collectively make what we call the mucosa, which is the innermost layer. Then as you move out, you have what we call the submucosa. Also have what we call the submucosa, which is going to be having blood vessels, lymphatics, and even also a type of a nerve plexus, which we call the submucosal plexus, which some people call the Meissner's. Okay. Then as you move out this kind of the muscular layer, the red one, this is what we call muscularis externa. Now the muscularis externa for the case of the stomach is a bit somehow unique, because it's going to be having 3 layers. Okay, it's going to be having the inner oblique, we're going to be having what we call the inner oblique, and the middle circular, and then what we call the outer longitudinal. This is somehow a bit unique from other parts of what we call the GIT, because in other parts of the GIT, the muscularis externa has the inner oblique, it has what we call the inner circular, and even also what we call the outer longitudinal. But in the stomach, it is somehow a bit unique, having the inner oblique, middle circular, and what we call the outer longitudinal. Okay. And then also have another kind of layer, the most outside layer of the stomach. You know how this layer is called? This is what we call the serosa, or some other people call it the adventitia. Okay, it is the outermost layer. Okay. Then when we come back to what we call the muscularis externa, we are going to be having another branch of the enteric nervous system, which we call the myenteric. Okay, it's going to be residing within what we call the circular and then longitudinal layer of the muscularis externa, and that kind of the plexus is going to be aiding in the peristaltic movement of the foods within what we call the GIT. Okay. And then, of course, the submucosal plexus within the submucosal layer is going to be aiding mainly in what we call the gastric secretions into what we call the stomach. Okay. So now that briefly covers the anatomy of the stomach. Okay. And if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, that you have grasped something, please, you can support me, and you can do that by a couple of means. You like the video, comment down in the comment section, and you can share this video to someone else that whom you think is this video makes a lot of sense. TUMNAD, as always, until we meet next time.